The Persian cavalry holds the riverbank. They are waiting to break him in the first charge. The river disrupts formation. The slope kills momentum. Any cautious commander would delay the battle. Alexander orders an immediate attack. For him, waiting is more dangerous than impact. He has no time, no money, no margin for a prolonged war. So why choose the attack where it appears to be a mistake? Macedon did not begin this war from a position of strength. It began in debt. When Philip was killed, he left his son the strongest army in Greece and an almost empty treasury. There were roughly 60 talents in reserve. For a state preparing to invade Persia, that was close to nothing. To launch the campaign, Alexander had to borrow hundreds more. In practical terms, he placed the state against the collateral of future victory. This was a war financed on credit. If the first months did not produce gold, the army would go unpaid. And an unpaid army is not an instrument. It is tension, distrust, the risk of revolt, especially when half of the Greek city-states had only recently hoped to break free from Macedonian control. Thebes had been destroyed, Athens had been subdued, but suppression is not the same as loyalty. One defeat in Asia and Greece could ignite again. Persia understood this. But in Susa, the threat was not viewed as existential. Darius III had only recently secured the throne after court intrigue. His priority was holding the imperial center. The Macedonian invasion looked like another raid, one of many over the centuries. The matter was assigned to the satraps of Asia Minor, regional governors, no full imperial mobilization, which meant one thing: Persia did not see this as a war for survival. For Alexander, it was exactly that. Differences in threat perception often decide outcomes before the first clash. One side cannot afford to lose. The other does not believe it can lose. And that asymmetry is already half the result. The Persians expected a barbarian. They encountered a system. Alexander's army was not the largest in the field, but it was the most structured. Its core was the phalanx, not just a dense formation, but a calculated instrument of pressure, 16 ranks deep, each soldier carrying a sarissa up to 6 meters long. The first 5 ranks projecting their spear points forward, which means one thing: an opponent does not meet a single spear, he meets a wall of iron. But the phalanx was not universal. It was strong to the front, vulnerable on the flanks, slow to pivot. Philip understood that, which is why the Macedonian army was not built around one arm, but around coordination. On the right flank, the companion cavalry, heavy cavalry drawn from the aristocracy. They did not skirmish at distance. They charged, formed in a wedge, the commander at the tip. The wedge did not simply collide with a line. It searched for weakness. It concentrated force at a single point. If the phalanx fixed the enemy in place, the companions broke his structure. Between them, the hypaspists, mobile elite infantry, the connective tissue. This was not a collection of units, it was a mechanism. Each element amplified the others. The Persian army was strong, but it was traditional. More cavalry, more personal valor, more individual skill, less systemic coordination. The Persians relied on numbers and martial reputation. The Macedonians relied on geometry. And this distinction was not yet visible to the satraps. They saw a young king. They did not see a new model of war. And that misreading would make the banks of the Granicus deadly, not for Alexander, but for them. In the spring of 334 BC, a war council gathers in Asia Minor. The satraps, the king's governors, understand that the invasion is real. The Macedonian army has already crossed the Hellespont, but the threat still feels limited, regional, contained. At the council, one voice sees further than the others. Memnon of Rhodes, a Greek in Persian service, an experienced strategist, a man who understands the Macedonian army firsthand. He proposes a simple solution. Do not offer battle. Withdraw inland, destroy supplies, burn the fields, deny Alexander food. Memnon identifies the central vulnerability. An army financed on borrowed money cannot sustain a long campaign without plunder. Stretch the war, and it will suffocate the Macedonians on its own. There is no need to risk the cavalry, no need for direct confrontation. Make time work against the invader. It is a strategic plan, possibly the only one that could have stopped the campaign at an early stage, but it is rejected. Why? First, pride. The satraps are not prepared to devastate their own territories. They are accountable to the king for regional revenue. Self-destruction would signal weakness. Second, politics. Memnon is Greek. A proposal to retreat, coming from a foreigner, sounds like cowardice. Third, the illusion of superiority. Persian cavalry has dominated the plains of Asia Minor for centuries. Why should it yield now? The council chooses open battle, and chooses it quickly. In that moment, Persia makes a critical mistake. It shifts the war from strategy to tactics. Instead of attacking the real vulnerability, logistics and finance, it decides to strike at a symbol, at Alexander himself. They try to solve the problem in a single day, but when an empire with centuries of history commits everything to one blow, it begins to operate on the terms of a younger opponent. And that is already a shift in initiative. The Granicus River did not look like an insurmountable barrier. It was not wide, not comparable to the sea Alexander had already crossed. Its strength was in the details. Spring, snowmelt, cold, fast water, an uneven riverbed. In some places, the depth rose above the waist. In others, sudden drops, the current pulling sideways. But the main problem was not the water. It was the eastern bank, a steep incline, loose gravel, mud where horses lose footing. Any rider emerging from the river would have to slow down, lift his spear, expose himself. And this is exactly where the Persian cavalry formed up. Not in reserve, not on open ground, directly along the edge. It looked like a perfect trap. The Macedonians would have to cross under pressure, climb upward, break formation. Persian riders held their spears at chest level. Their task was simple. Do not let them secure the bank. Kill Alexander once he becomes visible. This was targeted decapitation. The entire deployment suggests one assumption: the king would personally lead the charge. They were not trying to destroy the whole army. They were trying to eliminate its center of gravity. But this formation carried a weakness. Cavalry standing still loses momentum. It surrenders its greatest advantage: impact at speed. Instead of striking into the Macedonian line, they waited. They became a defensive wall. This is the subtle point. The Persians chose a position that increased their chance of killing the king, but reduced their freedom to maneuver. If the first clash did not decide the battle, they would be fighting on terms favorable to their opponent. They placed everything on the first minute, and by doing so, narrowed their own options. The river was no longer just an obstacle. It became a boundary between tactical urgency and long-range strategy. And now, the decision rests with Alexander. When the Macedonian army reaches the Granicus, the day is already fading. The light is lower, the shadows longer. Persian cavalry visible on the opposite bank. The position is difficult, the bank uneven, the crossing exposed. Parmenion, the most experienced Macedonian commander, advises delay. Make camp. Let the men rest. Attack at dawn. It is a rational proposal. During the night, the Persians may grow uncertain. They may pull back from the river. They may adjust their formation. In the morning, the crossing would be safer. This is military caution. But Alexander sees a different picture. If the army makes camp, it signals that the river has stopped them. If the enemy is given the night, he is given time to decide. Alexander does not want the Persians reconsidering battle. He wants this fight, here, now. His war runs on a timer. Every day without victory increases financial pressure. increases doubt. Surprise is also a weapon. The Persians do not expect an evening assault. They expect a pause. Refusing to wait is a psychological strike. There is another factor. This is the first serious obstacle the army has faced. If the king hesitates, hesitation spreads faster than orders. If the king moves first, doubt contracts. Alexander chooses risk, not from impulse, but to control tempo. He understands something fundamental. The moment you allow the enemy to decide whether battle happens, you surrender part of the initiative. He does not allow it. He orders preparations for attack. This decision becomes a point of no return. From here, either the campaign gains momentum or it ends, and the army moves toward the water. Alexander does not send the entire army into the river at once. First, a probing detachment, a test. The Persians react immediately. Cavalry shifts toward the crossing point, spears lower. And in that moment, the main movement begins. The companions enter the water, not head-on a diagonal. The current pushes against their flank. Horses lose alignment, shields grow heavier with spray. This is not a ceremonial charge. It is a struggle for balance. Horses slip on stone. Riders hold the spear in one hand, using the other to steady themselves. The Persians strike downward from higher ground. It is an advantageous position. The first Macedonian ranks can barely generate momentum. If formation collapses here, the river becomes a trap. But the formation does not collapse. This is where the difference appears, between a crowd and a mechanism. The Macedonians do not surge forward in disorder. They press the slope methodically, centimeter by centimeter. And when the first riders reach the bank, the engagement stops being a crossing. It becomes a fight. Alexander is visible. The white plume on his helmet makes him a marker. Persian commanders see the target. Mithridates, a relative of Darius, rides straight at him. They collide. Mithridates falls. It is bold, and boldness attracts response. Rhoesaces strikes at the king's head. The helmet cracks. The plume drops into the mud. Alexander is stunned. In that second, Mithridates raises his weapon behind him. The position is perfect. The king does not see the blow coming. One more moment, and the Macedonian army loses its center. Clitus the Black drives in from the side. A strike. The arm holding the weapon falls. Mithridates is killed. Alexander remains in the saddle. At times, history turns not on strategy, but on reaction speed. But if the formation had already broken, no individual act would have reversed the outcome. This moment matters because the system around him did not collapse. The deaths of the satraps changed the atmosphere on the field. Persian cavalry was held together by the authority of its commanders. It was an army of nobles, each leading his own following. When they fall, more than individuals are lost. The center of cohesion disappears. The line begins to waver. Meanwhile, the Macedonians secure the bank. Now the phalanx enters the fight. Not in a surge, not in a dramatic rush. Slowly. Sarissas extend forward. The formation aligns. What began as a chaotic clash of cavalry turns into sustained pressure. Persian horse cannot fully maneuver for impact. Space is limited. Room to accelerate is gone. And here, the consequence becomes clear. The Persians wagered on the first minute. The first minute failed. Now they are fighting under conditions they did not choose. The line fractures. The cavalry withdraws toward the plain. And at that point, the outcome is effectively set. Behind the cavalry stood the Greek mercenaries, heavy infantry. They had barely engaged in the first phase. When the Persian cavalry begins to withdraw, they are left exposed, isolated, without support. They understand what is happening, and they ask for mercy. Alexander refuses. This is not a burst of anger, it is a political decision. He cannot allow Greeks to fight for Persia and then disperse without consequence. If he releases them, it signals that the stakes were limited. If he punishes them, it signals that the war is absolute. The phalanx advances from the front. Cavalry seals the flanks. This is no longer the chaos of a river crossing, it is systematic destruction. Most are killed. The survivors are sent away in chains. From this point forward, the war acquires direction. It is no longer just an invasion. It is a declaration of terms. The Battle of the Granicus lasted only a few hours. Its consequences lasted for years. Before that day, the campaign looked like a gamble. After it, it became a sustained operation. The first thing to fall was not a city, it was a myth. The myth of Persian cavalry dominance on its own ground. The Macedonians demonstrated something concrete. They could be pushed back. Their commanders could be killed. Their line could break. That alters the psychology of war. Cities in Asia Minor begin opening their gates. Sardis, the administrative center of Lydia, surrenders with minimal resistance. And there, Alexander gains what he needed from the start: money. The satrapal treasury, gold that clears debt, gold that converts risk into capacity. From this point forward, the army is no longer fighting on borrowed funds. It is fighting with secured resources. Internal pressure decreases. But there is a second effect. The Persian fleet, dominant in the Aegean, begins to lose its coastal bases. Without ports, naval power becomes constrained. Alexander's rear is no longer critically exposed. The war stops being a defensive expedition. It becomes an advance into the interior of the empire. And one more shift occurs. After the Granicus, Darius can no longer dismiss the threat. This is no raid. It is an invasion that has eliminated his regional governors. The empire is forced to respond at the highest level. The Granicus did not decide the war. It changed its scale. Persia's main error was not a lack of courage, and not the choice of terrain. It was a miscalculation of risk. Strategically, they had options. They could have prolonged the war, struck at supply lines, let debt work against Alexander. Instead, they chose immediacy. They tried to solve the problem with a single blow, kill the man, rather than dismantle his capacity to fight. Alexander, by contrast, accepted tactical risk within a strategic framework. He understood something fundamental. Initiative outweighs comfort. Tempo outweighs safety. If the opponent is reacting, you are shaping the war. The Granicus marks the moment when a young king stopped being an heir and became the gravitational center of a campaign. After that day, Asia Minor ceased to be Persian territory. It became a corridor, a road to Issus, a road to Gaugamela, a road to imperial collapse. And it began with the decision to step into cold water.